good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. I'm Marwa Daoudi, an associate professor at the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies and the School of Foreign Service. This is a public lecture held at the center, but also in the framework of our class, Introduction to the Study of the Arab World. I am thrilled and honored today to host Dr. Miriyam Aouragh, a Dutch-Moroccan anthropologist and a reader at the Communication and Media Research Institute at the University of Westminster. Dr. Aouragh is very well known, but I will introduce her briefly to say she's a prolific researcher, a writer, and a very well-known activist in the field of social justice and class-related struggles. She grew up in Amsterdam as a second-generation Dutch-Moroccan and has a background in anthropology and non-Western sociology. Dr. Aouragh has studied the implications of the internet as it was first introduced in Palestine, to understand in particular the significance of techno-social evolutions by analyzing how a new technology coincided with the outbreak of a mass uprising. She subsequently focused on the political role of new digital tools and spaces as manifested through blogging and social networking, and her ethnographies were conducted among grassroots activists in Lebanon and Palestine. She also set up recently a critical research project to study the Arab counter-revolution, in which she relates critical theory with online-offline dialects. She writes about these themes in her books, her many books, actually. Palestine Online, published in 2011 with Hamza Hamouchen also. She recently co-edited The Arab Spring, A Decade On, about revolution and counter-revolution and the transformation of a region. And she has a book coming up with Paula Chakravarty on infrastructures of empire with SAGE in 2024. Today, Dr. Aouragh will be speaking on mediating the Makhzan, the trials and tribulations of Moroccan dissidents. We'll have you present with your slides, and then we'll have a Q&A session. Welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Marwa. It's lovely to be in, even though it's virtual, in your space. And we still miss you very much in Oxford, but this is a way for us to stay connected, to share our work. And I would love to also engage with the students and the staff and visitors online about this topic. Now, obviously, topics of activism in the region is very hot, especially since the Arab revolutions. The relation to media and social media is also very trendy, especially since the whole notion of the kind of like Twitter and Facebook revolution was challenged by many, many people, activists and researchers alike. And I have to say, I think the topic of Morocco has become even more popular since the World Cup in Qatar, because I think the Moroccan national team has done something quite interesting in terms of bringing back politics into the sphere of mass-mediated events like World Cups, and especially bringing back the politics of Palestine, which is under pressure because many of the countries, including Morocco that I'm discussing today, have actually sort of moved away from sort of previous political principled position regarding Palestine, Israel, and have accepted, or you could say, succumbed to pressure to accept normalization agreements. So Morocco has, in a way, during the World Cup, challenged the idea of a lot of academics that try to deduce social opinion or collective regards from political positions. And we have learned that you cannot conflate the two. Even though a political position of a country is, for instance, to accept normalization with Israel, the World Cup has shown that the Moroccan people actually, at its core and supported also by mass audiences, have not, and there's quite an alienated relation between decisions of states, nation states in the region, and the will of the people and opinion of the people. So I think, yeah, I just wanted to put Morocco in the wider spectrum. So Morocco also has an interesting relation when it comes to area studies frameworks. As you know, area studies frameworks are very related to political agendas. So I think you have read or discussed at some points in your classes or seminars the whole notion of Middle East studies, that itself is a product of international relations and foreign politics. And it's interesting because when you take that kind of framing, the question, of course, is where does Morocco then fit? Because the Middle East studies framework is very much also fed by, nurtured by all kinds of political challenges and dilemmas to do with Palestine, Israel, but also natural resources of oil. So Saudi Arabia, the Gulf, and big mobilizing countries like Egypt. But since I think a few decades, North Africa has become sort of subsumed under the framing of Middle East, and you often see that the addition of NA, so Middle East and North Africa, has become a sort of commonplace reference. Now, I won't delve into this semantic discussion a lot, but I think it's food for thought to think about our idea of regions and political spaces beyond geography and more in terms of shared history, shared language, shared culture. And in that sense, I think North Africa is a very clear example where the relation of peoples and histories actually cross and overlap continents. So Morocco, I want to also emphasize, is very much Africa, but also due to its shared history, culture, heritage, also very much what is called Middle East. And so there is this sort of relation between West Asia and North Africa. And those are the terms that are being used more commonly now. And those are the terms that that Hamza and myself decided to apply in our book on the Arab uprising. So we talk about, so there's Wana and there's Nawa. And so it depends on which one you want to start with. So we do Nawa and North Africa and West Asia. And there's a lot of people who also apply Wana, West Asia, North Africa, to kind of try to challenge also and to push back against, and some call it to decolonize area studies terminology. So in this particular presentation, a lot of the activist examples that I'm referring to are from the north of Morocco. So I've done a lot of field work, particularly between 2013 and 2018, 2019, in Tangier and Al Hoceima. So those are two cities that I have looked at. It's outside the space of this talk to go too much into what Tangier and Hoceima mean, but maybe in the Q&A we can come back to the importance also of these locations and colonial history of the north, which is particular because it's a colonial historical relation to Spain rather than France. So the topic in this presentation is related to themes around digital activism, online mediation, but also the notion of past and as present. So there's a booming development of research, particularly since the Arab uprising. And also it has to do, of course, with a sense of defeat of uprisings and a resurgence of memory studies. So like to remember, the hunger to maintain a certain memory of the present. So nostalgia, memory are topics and resistance. And in this paper, I want to discuss in particular the political ecology of movements of dissidents and the activist rituals that happen in those movements. And I think it's interesting because it's also part of a renewed interest in what is referred to commonly as political subjectivity. So this notion of political subjectivity that has emerged since the Arab uprising has produced a lot of debate also about the political left, because social movement, mass uprisings, usually in these sort of revolutionary moments that include mass mobilizations and communities, refer more to the political subjectivity of the left rather than other subjectivities. So some write about memory making and hunger to retain history. And often this is discussed and written about during moments of retreats. And that is not strange, of course, that once you see something is weakening or being lost, the sort of existential fear that also the experience, the feelings, the excitement, the wins and the gains will be lost. So these revolutionary processes that I'm referring to are obviously very mixed and messy, and they're not linear. And therefore, what is also important to remember is that the way these leftist subjective individuals and movements are shaped are also not linear. So I don't want us to interpret this as saying like, okay, one stage you had like mass mobilization, then you had defeats and a lot of memory studies, then you had at the end of that particular experience. That's not the case, because it's very mixed in terms of also temporality. So in some areas in Morocco, for instance, where you had a lot of discussion about a defeat, the 20 February movement is no longer, this is nostalgia. And I was even told at conferences, why are you talking about this? You're just like artificially trying to bring this back as if it's still happening. But, and it kind of shows also the lack of understanding of how different political realities and mobilizations are experienced across the country. So when, for instance, I don't take this literally, but when people were in a stage of defeat and sense of forget about this in Rabat or Casablanca, actually a new movement was being born in the Rif and Al Husayma. So when people were saying it's all over, forget about this, we didn't make it, their revolutions failed, Moroccans can't really shake this sense of impasse. The Hirak movement started in 2016 and 17 in Al Husayma, and that kind of really created new reverberations. So this is also really important to remember, that we're not talking about linear processes, but the trajectory of the Moroccan left, and I'm using the Moroccan left as a reference point because I think all semantics aside, and we academics, we love to disagree also about terminology. Why are you saying left? Why not just activism? They're not all leftists, some of them are liberal. Overall, when we look at the political movements and organizations and institutional support of a lot of the activist groups such as trade unions and human rights organizations, we are talking in a sense about the left. So a lot of questions were raised about how the new experiences of contemporary group actually linked to previous ones. And my approach is very much an anthropological approach, in that I have been part of those movements. Let me just try and see if I can move the slides. Can you see the next slide? Am I in tune? Okay, great. So my interest has been very much about how, as an anthropologist, I can understand and interpret what's going on the ground, and how they also have some historical relevance. And so the presentation is also very much part of existing and new work. And the main writings and collections I have made have to do with the, I think, article that you mentioned already, having shared, Marwa, the Middle East critique article, Makhzan. There's also the Ijmas article, Making and Shaping the Moroccan Left. And very much in the beginning, I tried to sort of write down a kind of like, you know, basic framing of the 20 February Morocco movement, which is what I am referring to here as well. So recurring disappointments notwithstanding, examples from Morocco show how leftist activists continue to shape radical political transformations. The outburst of protests in 2016 under the slogan Al-Hirak al-Sha'bi can be understood as a continuation of the mass protests that roiled the country in 2011 under the now legendary emblem Harakat 20 February, which in turn connected to earlier mobilizations. And so this dual reading of protest as both praxis and maintenance being also the importance behind some of the memory and archiving practices, demands a complex interrogation beyond idealized and static notions of the left. So local experiences have shed light on how the left is organized in Morocco. Although the experiences I try to document from the local fieldwork is therefore by default selective. It would be a geographical reference to those experiences. On the other hand, there are also generic national scale observations we can make about the experiences, which is what I try to do by explaining the left political ecology. So what is the ecology in which activists, movements, and people coming in and out of movement operate, and how they experience? I think political life in Morocco exists under unique conditions. It is what I consider to be a Makhzanian ecology. So when I talk about the political ecology, this is a kind of Makhzan related ecology. And the Makhzan is a reference to the political system in Morocco, and it often has a negative connotation. So it often is about the authoritarian system that combines coercion and consent. And there is, of course, a whole semantic history of what Makhzan means. And obviously it has to do with power over capital. So Makhzan being the original space basket where a capital that is accumulated was stored. The idea is also that the Makhzan in Morocco is a system that also is the main actor in the accumulation of capital in Morocco. So the Makhzanian ecology is in essence also what cultivates the left. The left is not immune to that. Morocco cannot be reduced to just some kind of mythical monarchy. Sometimes you hear that in reports, as if kind of like this, the only specific thing about Morocco that is so special is that it has this one of the oldest dynasties, and that the king is gaining his legitimacy through this charismatic position of also the Sharif, like to have like Sharifain descent. But that's too simple. And as we've seen also with the, of course, Arab uprisings, a lot of these simplistic ideas about countries have been sort of destroyed, you know, like whether about Syria or Morocco, like in one case, it would be typical Republican post-colonial regime, which is the reason why it's difficult for people to rise up. And in other contexts, it's the opposite argument. It's because it's not a republic post-colonial experience, but a continuation of a very traditional monarchy that they cannot rise up. And in both contexts, we've seen mass uprisings. So what is this Makhzanian ecology? The ecology of the Moroccan left represents three concentric circles, as you can see here also on this slide. The first circle is the heritage of an unfinished revolution. So it's really important to understand that Morocco as a system, as a state, as a economic system, it is the product of a settled decolonization. So Morocco was a protectorate of France. It was both occupied by France and Spain during anti-colonial struggles in the region. Algeria was the main threat to the status quo of colonial power, and the potential of mass uprising and also extreme loss of strategic importance and natural resources in Morocco meant that it had to be resettled in a very particular and quick way. And the famous expression at the time of the colonial powers, also of the Americans at the time that were seeking alliances with the colonial powers, was never again another Algeria. So the fear was that Morocco would turn into another Algeria. And so the settled decolonization had consequences also for what it meant for actual independence. So it was signing of a contract, and the famous Moroccan revolutionary leader, Mehdi Ben Barka, described it as an agreement by which we won and lost at the same time. So he's referring to the ultimate failure of reaching qualitative change and true justice beyond formal independence. Mehdi Ben Barka's original assessment from 1969 can be found for those who are interested in Mehdi Ben Barka's The Lost Revolution, which was at the time published in the International Journal of Politics. Now, Ben Barka was a revolutionary figure. He moved from a kind of center left to a sort of more radical left political position, and was a very central also in the international movement, the three-continental movement, and was a leader of the Pan-African movement. Like what happens with a lot of these very intelligent, appealing, charismatic, and independent figures, people who are not easily bought, Ben Barka was assassinated. So he was kidnapped and assassinated in 1965 in France. And interestingly enough, only in recent years, I mean, every few years, there's like a revival of interest. But in recent years, there's been an increasing number of testimonies that have pointed with evidence of testimonies to a joint Moroccan, Israeli, and French operation in the assassination of Ben Barka. Interestingly enough, the Israeli Mossad agents that were involved have come out and done interviews about this assassination. This is also interesting because it confirms what a lot of people already said, that since its inception, Morocco was also an important de facto, although not public, ally of Israel. In any case, for this reason, a lot of left militants in the 1960s regarded the new regime, the new independent Morocco under King Hassan II as a new colonization. That's what they call it, a new colonization. And this tension lasted a long time, and many leftist activists today consider the Kingdom of Morocco to exist in neo-colonial relations with France and Spain as its subsidiary. And if you are a political economist or a geographer and you do some digging and some fact-finding and empirical research, you will find that that's also the case, if you follow the money and see who owns what. This was already understood from the beginning, as I said, and so this tension was untenable, of course, and this has led to enormous student protest and workers' protest in the 60s and 70s. It fueled mass protests in the 70s, also in direct response to the visit of the then Spanish Prime Minister, who came to Morocco as if it was still a colony. So the second circle is related to the way the Makhzan state crafted a biopolitical system built on the three taboos of king, land, and religion. The core motive to repress those who transgress these red lines, referred to usually as Khatt al-Ahmar, you cannot cross the Khatt al-Ahmar, is a core motive is a fear of independent thinking. It was also quite known that Hassan al-Thani at the time, and some of that you still feel, was really scared of. That's why also the student movement was suppressed very much, and public intellectuals were considered enemies of the states. There was such fear of independent thinking of the people. And the third and final circle is the deep resentment on the left for the wealthy state elites and their system. This also shapes the ecology of the left, like what motivates people, what feeds their anger. And it is precisely because Morocco is a deeply unequal capitalist society that it also inhibits a recurring inclination towards social unrest. It's a very unstable country because it's so unequal. And there is deep resentment about that. And if you are on the streets during protests, you hear that also in the slogans and in the chanting, references in the chanting to the wealth of the country, references to having two oceans. Morocco is on the Atlantic and on the Mediterranean. It has enormous agriculture, it has phosphate, it has, and still it's a very poor country. So this specific ecology influences the experiences of the Moroccan left, because also, to be honest, like it's difficult for the left, but at the same time, there's always reason to mobilize, and people are always, happy to join and support particular demands, for instance, against privatization or strikes against companies. But I think it's interesting also the way how this relates to the second circle, right? The fear for independence thinking has, of course, to do with the fact that to realize how the revenues and wealth of a country is being divided is really dangerous. I mean, it's not a fair comparison, but if you compare this to a country that actually is poor also in its natural resources, that doesn't actually have much, that doesn't have a good climate because of climate change, then, it's kind of difficult to understand how this could be manifested into spontaneous anger. But in a country where the division is so clear and in your face, and this is why this fear is always there, because it knows that it can spark like that. And so activists often refer to the famous, this famous moment when King Hassan al-Thani had a televised broadcast during student and workers' protests, where he said, he gave this speech where he kind of tried to influence people through televised broadcasting to not listen to academics and intellectuals, and actually to not send their children to university. And he said, allow me to tell you, there is no greater danger to the state than the so-called intellectual. It would have been better for you to be illiterate. And this is a famous opinion and expression by the king that actually Mati Munjib discusses in his work on La Monarchie Marocaine. Munjib, by the way, is a public intellectual who has been in and out of prison in the last 10 years and in and out of very dangerous hunger strikes. So those are the three ecological circles. And remember what I said about the Khat al-Ahmar, king, land, and religion. This is really interesting because Morocco is also a modern neoliberal nation state. It's different from other repressive authoritarian regimes where you also see the same, but actually where that is also translated in the absence of free press or the absence of like diversity in media. In Morocco, actually, this Khat al-Ahmar happens at the same time as having a very vibrant, dynamic media and journalism ecology. It's under pressure. People fight. People are constantly arrested for writing things that are not accepted. But the infrastructure is actually quite open. So there's no lack of diversity. In fact, even sometimes I get a little bit annoyed by the kind of like, lazy references to like the indigenous politics and how the repression has to do also with repressing the Amazigh. Actually, I having also done a lot of research in Hoceima And I am myself Amazigh, and my mother tongue is Tamazight. And I can tell you, like, there's no lack of Tamazight in the news or in the media. Like, we have programs, our news broadcasting. The problem is what they say. So you will have, in the 4 different Amazigh languages, you will have programs that just reiterate the same propaganda from the States. And so kind of also questions this idea of diversity as representation. Like, if it doesn't also mean representation in terms of content, then actually that is not very, like, it becomes a bit less interesting after years of being repressed in your own language as a kind of nice democratic diversity. So what is the Moroccan left? For those who are interested, I thought maybe I should give you a few indications on that as well. Roughly speaking, we are talking about Marxist, socialist, and anarchist tendencies, and often also liberal group that move in and out. So that's why I said it's not linear. Huh? So depending on the barometer in society, if revolutionary sentiments are really high, like the liberal center political side can also move more to the radical left. And you see, for instance, fusions between parties happening. And of course, the opposite happens as well. These groups are often organized very organically in social movements and political parties sometimes, but there's a taboo on the left to actually join elections because it would be considered the acknowledgement of the regime's false democracy. These movements have not been equally influential. They're not all equally influential, but it has seen some interesting shifts in the history. For instance, the contemporary Socialist Union of Popular Forces, USFP, is among the more flexible parties, accepting and guiding some of the most neoliberal policies of the Makhzan, but its predecessor, the National Union of Popular Forces, the UNPF of the 1960s, was actually a key historical component of the left, in which Mehdi Mermarka, who I just mentioned, played a leading role. So the predecessor of the USFP was actually a key force also in internationalist, socialist, and non-aligned movements. The USFP has also a more grassroots and activist tradition, and in Morocco, it refers mostly to its Marxist variant. An essential cornerstone of contemporary current Moroccan activist movements basically comes down to 2 groups: the Marxist Nahja Demokrati and Al-Munadila. Of these 2, their antecedents are the famous Ila al-Amam, Marxist-Leninist Maoist group Ila al-Amam from the 70s, known also from the work of Ibrahim Sarfati and other Ila al-Amam figures. And the antecedent of Al-Munadila is the Trotskyist Fourth International. What is unique for me is that both broke with the Moroccan Communist Party. The Moroccan Communist Party, that was later renamed the PPS, is actually not in the collective sense of like the left and radical left history considered very important. The Moroccan Communist Party had also capitulated to the regime and became actually irrelevant also partly for the reason of its nationalism. This is really important because the Sahara, the Western Sahara, is a very important topic in the Moroccan left and just, progressive politics in general. So the PPS, for instance, the Moroccan Communist Party, its position was that the Sahara was Morocco. And it's really interesting. I think this split, this independence from the Communist Party has rendered Moroccan Marxist leftist politics, socialist politics quite dynamic. And I think more interesting than I see in a lot of other Arab or African countries. So take, for example, Al-Munadila's position during the Arab uprisings in support of the Syrian revolution. A lot of leftist parties in the region actually did not, were actually more pro-Assad. Munadila's rejection of Bashar al-Assad and the whole statist campus politics in recent years has been really as important, I think, as in the past, Ilal Amam's position on the self-determination of Western Sahara. So I think one of the key reasons, it was part of the Khat al-Ahmar. If you remember, land is one of the Khat al-Ahmar, and it comes down to the Sahara. And it comes also down to ideas about separation in the Rif. But Ilal Amam and its follow-up, Najd Democratia, had a very democratic position vis-a-vis the Sahara. Much more radical, I think, than a lot of contemporary leftists. So how does the left movement develop and grow in such a political ecology? Now, obviously, it develops and grows, but it has to maneuver a lot of surveillance, monitoring, a lot of also repression. So the freedom of press has been under pressure in Morocco since actually the revolutionary uprisings. A lot of hunger strikes because of political prisoners, and these are this is the ecology around which they have to maneuver. Let me just go back to what I said at the beginning about my objective, right? I said that I was interested in the different kinds of also memories. So there's the melancholic memory, dictatorial memory, and productive activist. So the melancholic, it's interesting. Maybe that's also what happens with revolutions. It brings back a lot of memories of the past and what happened before. So there's been this really interesting revival also of a kind of nostalgic view of Morocco from the past. So you have all these interesting video websites where you can find like black and white pictures of Morocco, the resistance in Morocco, contradictions in Morocco. Tangier is, by the way, a very interesting city reference point for nostalgia. There's a lot of nostalgia about Tangier, also because of the beatniks in Tangier, the American and European hippies. And so there's a lot of food for nostalgia in Morocco. But we shouldn't forget that it cuts both ways. We cannot be selective in what we like to see as nostalgia. There's also a lot of dictatorial nostalgia, this idea of the strong man. There's a lot of kind of like wishy-washy critique now about Mohammed the Sixth. Like he's not as strong. He's always away. He's always on holidays. He wears funny clothes. Like the strong man of Hassan Tani. Some people keep referring to also the Green March, when Morocco organized this march under the leadership of Hassan to go and reclaim and reconquer the Sahara. But what I wanted to end this with, I think I have to, Marwa, how am I doing on time?
Okay, you're fine. You're fine.
10 minutes?
Yeah, maximum.
Okay, maximum 10 minutes. What I'm interested in is this sort of active nostalgia, this way whereby you hark back to the past, you bring back the past, that is activating. And so what we've seen also in the last years is magazines, filmmakers, referring back to moments and incidents of the past. So this is Telkel is a famous cover of Telkel, where you see then Crown Prince Hassan II preparing to join the forces to go to the Rif, and during a very, very bloody history, which is also, I really recommend those who haven't seen it. I'm sure some of you have already seen it. Breaking the Silence, Brise de Silence. It's a film by Tariq Al-Idrisi, a documentary film, which is freely available online, and which he has managed to get English, French, Spanish, Arabic subtitles for. So it's really interesting also to use this in the classroom. And it's based on also footage and interviews, and really a creative integration also of comic style documentary making to talk about what happened in 1958, 1959, which was silenced and covered up for a long time and is now coming back. So one of the interesting connections with digital media is how digital media as a platform has allowed for the reverberation of these histories to be actually archived and to have a place that you can find. So for instance, talk about nostalgia and Tangier. One of the reference points, of course, is Mohammed Shukri's work, Al-Khubz al-Hafi. It's one of the most famous works from Morocco. I think it's actually also read in the wider Arab world. And so it has been filmed, and this film is now made accessible on YouTube. So digital media is connected with what I'm saying also as a reference point, as a way to archive and to make accessible. Another way to think about it is how activists have their own rituals. And at these rituals, whether it's the picket line, I just had a picket line today, by the way. We are on strike for weeks here in the UK in higher education. So we had a teach out in front of the university, and we discussed media and racism and racialization. And those are rituals, those teach outs, picket lines, they are like rituals. Rituals work very interestingly. They bond people, they create commitments, they also allow you to archive, right? Like to actually be there, to take pictures, to note, to talk about things. You refresh each other's memory, but also they are important physical interactive moments. And one of the rituals that I found during field work was dikras. You had like moments where people would get together to remember a dikra, to dikr. And those dikras are often temporal moments. They have to do with مثلا, the 2-year anniversary of the 20 February movement, or 50 years since the 58, 59 massacres, or 1 year since the Hirak Shabi in Rif, or 2 years since the the arrest of the cadre of Hirak in Al-Husayma. So those dikras are important moments to pin down, to organize people. And what is important about these dikras is that they are also spatial moments. So they become spatial mediators. They have to be on the ground. So they do this deliberately in order for their moment of their dikra as activist groups is directly in touch with bystanders. So people who pass by, and they do it like in strategic spaces, but often also in Shabi neighborhoods, in popular residential neighborhoods. So that these dikra moments, these rituals also become moments where people can hear alternative news, alternative analysis. So often you see them in circles and halqas, and then people are standing, and then bystanders come and they stand there, they listen like for 5 minutes, and then they continue, and this coming and going, and they pick up bits and pieces. It could be that they pick up things from the past, or that they could pick up things from what just happened, but the media is not sharing. So this is an important, I think, ritual. And what happens at these activist ritual is that also previous backlashes are recalled, but also martyrs, activists who were killed or tortured are remembered. So that's very important at the Dikra. So activist chants would often include names of left-wing activists like Saida Mnabhe, or she was a student activist who died in prison in 1976, or Zubaydah Khalifa, who was killed in 1988, actually during a Palestine protest during the first Intifada. The activists react by stating openly that they know what the regime is up to. And I hope you managed to get that also from the article Al-Makhzan al-Aqbari, because that's the title, is part of the slogan. And saying that basically that they know what the Makhzan is up to, and in so doing that they reject the cosmetic changes that the Makhzan keeps offering. So they want the people and each other to remember the lessons of the past and the attempts by the state to create divide and rule or to undercut them. And so this chant of المخزن العقباري بغى يرجعنا لللوري للأيام الرصاص عود تاني للعهد الحسن الثاني. the Makhzan wants to take us back to the years of lead, to the years of Hassan al-Thani, and again to the oppression. So basically it's trying with these songs to give people the sense of like, some things don't change, remember how they did this before. And this component of productive memory is still found also in public odes, which is what I wanted to end with, if that's okay with you. These are rituals during which activists swear allegiance to the struggle. And when a group of political activists did this when they were released after a year of imprisonment, I was struck by the symbolic value of it. So this idea of swearing allegiance to the struggle, the moment after they arrived from, so when they are released, I guess this happens everywhere in the same way. These were activists from Al-Husayma that were arrested with trumped-up charges. There was nothing. They were part of the cadre of activists, but that was it. They often don't announce when they're released, but only once they get back to their cities, by that time, people will have been informed and they will be waiting for them, welcoming them, you know. So the moment they got out of their cars and started hugging and crying, these activists started to chant this ode, this ritual of a promise. And in this chant, I hope you can hear it in a moment, where they chant basically, I swear by the Almighty, and it, of course, oath has religious connotations. Huh? When you say Wallah or Aqsimu Billah, it has very heavy weights. It's basically saying, if you find me betraying this, I hereby give you permission to hold me accountable. So it's a way to keep people also believing in the struggle, because you are afraid to like be caught betraying your own oath. So it's, I swear by the Almighty to never betray and to never sell out our cause, even if that costs our life, even if that costs our soul. And as they acclaim their oath, bystanders are filming, others are screening through Facebook Live. And in this way, they honor those who sacrificed their life before them and during that, because people were killed also in that struggle. But it also incurs a sense of pride, sharaf. We haven't bowed down for the regime. We're still standing, even though we're released, we're still swearing to continue. And sometimes they would chant during that oath the same thing that they were arrested for, right? So you saw that with some of the activists. So I want to end by just maybe 1 minute of that video.
أقسم بالله العلي العظيم ألا نخون ألا نخون ألا نخون ألا نخون ألا نساوم وألا نساوم وألا نساوم وألا نساوم وألا نبيع وألا نبيع وألا قضيتنا 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 قضيتنا.
So I think I will stop it here, because I took too much of your time. And yeah, if you have any questions, I'm very happy to hear them. And I'm also happy to share the link to this video.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Miriyam, for this brilliant analysis of also intellectual history, but also activism praxis. You really resonated with a lot of the themes that we see in our class. For example, the battle over semantics, Middle East studies, area studies, the colonial legacies of these area studies as well, the imperialist and imperial legacies, as well as we've seen in the US, the formation of area studies is very much around imperial designs. And I thought it was very interesting also how this frames the exceptionality of the Arab world and Morocco, which you mentioned as well. Morocco is always the outlier, right?
Yes.
The stable sort of country in the Arab world, monarchy, and it's not stable, as we can see. There's a lot of dissent, a lot of resistance, but it's hushed, and it's not necessarily relayed outside. I really very much enjoyed this idea of the 3 taboos around land. We've discussed Western Sahara, I think, at some point also in the questions. And also, finally, your question about diversity as representation, as a question, really, in terms of the press, but also we see it here in the US. There's a lot of talk about DEI, but is it really questioning the inequitable structures, or is it sort of a continuation in another form of these inequitable representations? So thank you so much. That was really fascinating. I'd like to open the floor now to questions. I'll start by taking questions from the audience here. Whoever would like to start with jumping in. Yes, John, yes.
Thank you, Dr. Aouragh,
Aouragh,
for taking the time out to speak with us. I noticed in your book, especially in your introduction, that you talk a lot about neoliberal policies and the mainstream media hijacking these revolutions to speak about how they are about going against autocratic regimes instead of the economic and social policies that neoliberal interests bring into the countries. And other articles that we read talk about not only the economic policies, but for instance, NGOs mediating on the behalf of feminist issues instead of feminist organizations having parity with other parts of the revolution. And I'm sure you understand, especially from the introduction of yourself, talking about your interest in social media and how that affects the revolutions and how important it is to control the narrative for external support of revolutions, putting pressure on those regimes at the same time. My question is, how can revolutionaries control this narrative through social media, but not only control the narratives to show the injustices that regimes are having on the people, but also to remove the grip of neoliberal policies, since they do so well in masking their interests as helping the area instead of what they really do, which is create this or widen the economic and social gap between the regime or the Makhzan and the people. How can revolutionaries do this without having everybody outside of their state read Orientalism or have a class on negative effects on neoliberal policies?
Thank you. Marwa, is it okay if we collect a few questions so I can catch my breath a little bit?
Sure, sure. And if you want to drink some water and think about your
Where is the
answers.
water? Where?
virtual water. So it's the water day, by the way, today. Maybe another question, Mark? Yes, Dr. Drury, our postdoc researcher.
Maybe I'll take stuff so you can hear me,
Sure.
but I'm going to stay off camera. Thank you, Dr. Aouragh, for that amazing presentation. I have many questions and we'll have to, I think, follow up by email on some. I do have done research with Sahrawi activists, so I appreciated your incorporating that in the talk. But my question is more about, well, two things, if I may. One is about ritual. It seems, as you mentioned it, that the in-person nature was important to ritual of the dhikr, the halaqat. And I wondered then, what is the relationship between ritual and media? Is digital media necessarily sort of derivative or second order in preserving these memories of activists? That's one question. And the other is about not only political subjectivity, but the political subject, the revolutionary political subject. Does the Moroccan left still or currently refer to the working class, or is there a multitude of different terms? And do they use the term kadeh? I was just curious about that.
Thank you for that, Mark.
The last thing?
Specifically kadeh.
Kadeh, the
Like
term kadeh, do
yeah.
they use it still? Do you want a third question maybe, or do you want
Oh, yes, of course. Whatever you say, Dr. Daoudi, I follow your guide. No, thank you.
answer? Do you want to answer? Please go ahead. Yeah.
Sure. No, thank you. Yeah. Why don't I take what I can now and then see if I forgot something, remind me, yeah? Because I wrote it down. But so first, on the economic policies, and I think it is really, really crucial to understand Morocco through the lens of political economy and class relations, because I think this, what also, Marwa, what also you said about this kind of the exception, Morocco is the exception, the good exception, the poster boy. What it leaves often in the discussion is a focus on religion, the role of the claim to the Sharifain heritage in maintaining the dynasty. But actually, sometimes that is at the cost of political economy, and actually understanding also Morocco as a neoliberal product of capitalism, whereby the accumulation of capital has also emerged in a very colonial way. So we need decolonial political economy to understand Morocco. I think this is really important. So the economic policies, for instance, have been very early on geared to neoliberal strategies, not even during Hassan Thani's life, because he was very much a top-down state control and had a kind of like quite, similar to some of the other Arab regimes where the political economy was very horizontal and centralized. But even at the end of his life, and particularly in preparation of the new king, and the way that overlapped historically with the fall of the Soviet Union in the 1990s, the sort of like reshaping of global politics, you saw this kind of acceptance of Western capitalism. And interestingly enough, it was a similar experience across different countries, whereby the ascendance of a new king or king-like president opened the door for free market economy. So the narrative of the free market economy was very much shaped by notions of modernity and progression. And you saw this very smoothly framed around a new young person. So it was Bashar al-Assad, Abdullah, and Mohammed Sadis. Around the same 3 to 4 years, you saw this shift from kind of like what was considered old school type political and economic state to a new school. These are young men who have been also educated in the West, or have a different idea. And what they did, they all really deepened and encouraged free market neoliberal policies. Now, that's all nice. It's just that it's a very unequal system. It's a capitalist policy. So it leads to inequality. And that is what has happened. And that is what has also been predicted by people like Ben Barka, who therefore said we won and lost at the same time. And so this leads to also the question of the revolutionary subject and its relation to class. It is almost inevitable. There is a very strong link to between political opposition and political agendas and semantics and narratives and topics that people write about or organize around, and class, because of the way that neoliberalism has created also this class subject of workers. Often you see a mass sort of migration from rural to urban centers in Morocco, whereby, for instance, former farming or agriculture type workers have transitioned into labor, selling their labor to working class subjects. And often this comes with political repression in the sense that, for instance, in Tangier, there are a lot of what they call tax-free zones. This is also colonial heritage, where you have tax-free zones of the French, of the Spanish, and working in a tax-free zone, for instance, means there's always clashes around the right to unionize. It's not allowed to have a union in a tax-free zone, factory, or a space for labor. So that creates also a lot of attention, but also it makes logic the role of the trade unions as part of the left in those dynamics. So the question on revolutionary control of the narratives, I think it's really important to understand that we have come out of a period of a lot of confusion, whereby there was this kind of push to think that online mediation is kind of replacing the sort of the street politics, and how also online politics is so much better because it gives back control for people who can just make a website or send something on Facebook and then compete with the state propaganda. Now both are wrong, because even if you have access to certain platforms, the weight and the importance projected on one voice is not the same as another voice. So even if you have 5 voices, it doesn't mean that they're all equally important or listened to. And that has to do, obviously, with the whole history of broadcasting, public media, the ideas around the proper news that has been investigated or relayed versus what is now almost common, like individual opinions shared with some kind of notion of being a citizen journalist. So you will still, even though there is the availability in terms of the infrastructure to mediate alternative or competing news, there is a strong hierarchy in what gets to be heard, who is being heard. Having said that, the most interesting relation that I found is where the online platforms and infrastructures that are actually important and qualitatively different for activists are combined with activists' communication in their own on their own terms. And what is their own terms? That is what I meant by the rituals. The halqas, the dikras, the picket lines, the marches, the protests, the actual physical moments where activists are in touch with the audience, that is what carries weight, what gives it legitimacy. But then having an infrastructure that allows you to amplify that, to resubmit that to a wider audience, is the magic link. So all those online projects we've seen, not just about, this is the universal problem, right? This is a universal dilemma, conundrum. This is not just Morocco. Even like all those like anti-racist, Black Lives Matter campaigns that were only online didn't manage, they didn't stay. But the Black Lives Matter campaigns that were actually grassroots, and for instance in Ferguson, were also intimately connected with local organizing and Palestinian solidarity, those are the ones that remain. So you see the connection between a very sophisticated, forward-looking, techie type of online mediation with the actual turf of the activists. Their turf is the street, it's the people. That is what matters, I think. And the other thing that really matters with the online mediation, besides amplification, is that it allows to archive. Archiving is not so much about your question of like competing with over the control of narratives in the present, but it does respond to if that question would be in the future tense. control over the narratives that is being prepared now for the future. That is why, for instance, a lot of projects have emerged of online archiving of the Arab revolutions, and specific in relation to Syria. Why? Because it is one of the most contested narratives. Actually, a lot of people, they kind of like believe you, and the people, when, you know, they talk about Palestine, Israel, or even Morocco, like, it's not a very liked regime. But Syria, and often also Lebanese activists, because they operate in a very different political ecology, namely one whereby the state, the suppressor, is on another level actually considered a progressive force in a kind of like anti-imperial reading, it is much more contested. So yeah, you know, the white helmets are paid by American imperialists or whatever. So for that kind of contested, very troubled situation, archiving in the present is crucial, because there will come a time, we will come back to this in 10 years, where people will say, yeah, but wasn't it, didn't it happen that people like were paid to like protest, and then they protested and toppled, and then you said, no, that was not the case. People protested because they were hungry, they were angry, they wanted freedom. Look at these beautiful books and documentaries and footage and what have you. So I think also let's think about the difference between the present and future competition over revolutionary narratives.
Thank you very much, Miriyam. I'll take questions from the online audience, and I'll come back to you. So in relation to this question of rituals and memory, there's a question by Ben Jones about what role does music play in the nostalgia of contemporary protests? How is Nas al-Riwan Zahira music incorporated into nostalgia for the left of the 1970s? That will be the first question, Miriyam, and then I'll move on also to a second question, possibly from the audience. Abdullah Al-Arraj asks, in light of current global inflation and the rising cost of living for most Moroccans, coupled with a large unemployed young population and the rising national debt and the government's inability to fund basic services, and the king's absence in the political scene, do you foresee a large popular uprising and perhaps a call for regime change?
By the way, if people also have an opinion or want to answer, please step in, because often there are people in the audience at the table who know much more or as much as you do about a certain specific subtopic. So please chime in if you also disagree with what I'm saying. Yeah, this nostalgia is interesting, isn't it? The left and its nostalgia, and the way that it has to have a cultural expression. It's like sensors in like some digital media studies. There's been an interesting shift or an interesting interest in understanding sensors, like feeling through what you see, through what you touch, through what you hear. I think hearing is a sensorial aspect of memory that is extremely powerful. Just, sometimes even hearing the first beat before you even heard the song, it already gives you shivers, and it brings back memories. I think now, I think we are now 11 years, 11 years. I think every time people and myself hear that famous song from Dara in Syria, where they chant, I'm always asked actually not to sing because I have a horribly ugly voice. So I'm not going to do that. But yeah, Yalla Irhal Ya Bashar, and that tune, it's kind of like a Debka type of tune. I'm not sure if that will go down in history as the anthem of the Arab revolutions, not just Syria. So I think whenever we hear that, there's something about the tune, and I think the rhythm of Nas al-Riwan that does that for Moroccans. The curious thing here, though, is that, of course, it's not been that long ago, because National One has maintained as a kind of part of the repertoire of dissidents, and into the 80s and 90s, when a lot of student protest happened, into the 90s, a lot of people that then left to Europe and organized invitations for National One to come and give concerts in France, in Brussels, in Holland. So there's an interesting diasporic element there as well. And you can raise new questions about whether nostalgia and this interest in National One also is something that is stronger when you are in the diaspora. When you are in exile, there tends to be more like space for nostalgia and memory than when you are inside in the messiness. I think that the interesting fact with National One is that for those who've been following them intimately for quite for all this time, there had been a lot of disappointment already, because they had, in a way, it's very difficult, and I'm going to make enemies now, because there is this very strong loyalty, like National One, like the classic National One, but actually they sold out along the way. Like some of their, of course, some of their famous members had already died, so the new formation of National One continues, and they perform at state organized festivals. They perform for the Makhzan as television broadcastings, and so people have always been a bit like confused by that, to say it politely. So it's interesting, National One, because it's not just the past. Of course, the work from the past is much more political and interesting, but they actually continue. They are still giving concerts. They are still using the same calligraphy and style of photography for their posters that have this strong feel of a 1970s. I am in a position that I can say it matters for retaining a memory of the 1970s, but also it shouldn't be overestimated, because sometimes harking back in nostalgic ways to the past blocks also interesting new developments in the present. And so what I would also say is, how does the contemporary, the generation of the 20 February movement that is has a cultural expression in the language of hip hop, how does that correspond with National One? So I would be interested, for instance, I mean, Al-Haqad is a famous figure of the 20 February movement, and currently Moroccan hip hop is amazing. It's breaking YouTube records and coming out with hip hop that is very critical of the regime, of freedom of speech crackdowns. So I would be interested to see how do they confluate together. And often a way to look at this would be how samples are used. So you will have samples from National One songs that are part of like the contemporary. And I think there's a kind of respectful agreement that you don't, there's a respect for National One, that you're not too harsh about them, because their impact is so enormous. But at the same time, as academics, as students, it's our role to be annoyingly critical, right? It's our role to ask, to do the double critique and to say, well, yeah, is it still like, why is it still that big in terms of its role for the left, whereas it has actually been playing quite problematic role when it comes to the current band and formation of the band performing those old songs. That is why it's difficult. It's not that they're performing in a new formation with new albums. They constantly repeat the same songs from the 70s, which had a very different connotation. But then you see them performing that in big Makhzan concerts, and you're like, something is wrong in this combination. Maybe I forgot a question, but I don't know, do remind me.
Do you foresee large protests happening, considering all of the issues that are happening now in Morocco?
Yeah, I think it's very fragile. I think also Morocco is not immune to global dynamics. So the global economic crisis, the financial crisis that had started in 28 is still happening. It's still reverberating. Morocco is not immune. The ecological crisis, Hamza Hamouchine, actually, I would really recommend his work. He works on environmental politics. Also in the Maghreb, some really damaging developments going on there. Every few years, there is a climate catastrophe. There will be rain or earthquake dramas happening, particularly in areas with a very weak infrastructure. And all of those events deepen, of course, the instability, and sometimes they spark and they lead to major protests. And we've seen that happening also not long after the Hirak in Al Husayma, where in other areas, mining areas, like small incidents can the fragility means that you cannot predict, like something can very unexpectedly lead to mass protests, whereas other things that are far worse just don't, because people are just so exhausted and tired. Yes, I think things are very dire. I'm very impressed by the people's ability to still maintain hope and be critical and organized. But I'm also really worried when I see since a few years an enormous increase in illegal migration. I'm using the term illegal as it's used by the EU. We've had this up until the 90s, and then it receded because the economic situation increased, and also the restrictions of Fort to Europe were so bad and so violent that it didn't make sense anymore to cross the Dul al-Hagra. And now you see this happening again, a repeat of what we saw in the 80s. People are taking dungeons, are crossing the Mediterranean or the Atlantic, dying on the way. So many people are on the bottom of the sea that nobody can identify. So we're going back to this period where desperation had led people to do the Harraga, to go to Europe. And that is a very bad sign, because that means that people are desperate. And when I say people, of course, I mean younger people, because those are the more, among the majority of people trying to cross to Europe are the younger generations. And if they do that, for sociologists, it should be a sign. It means something is, I think Abdullah's question also relates to that, right? Like, yes, I think it's a matter of time. And I also think, I don't know what he thinks, maybe he has an answer, but I also find it very curious, the whole sort of absence of the king. This whole dynamic also around it's not going well. He might take a step back. And the grooming of his son. And I don't want to end on this very depressive note, but actually the grooming, the symbolism, so his son is called Hassan. So he will be Hassan Thalith. He looks a lot like his grandfather. And he has this very militaristic, mechanical demeanor to him. Like he's very young, but he already does a lot of the ritual performance that his father does, and he's stoic. The hand kissing, the feet kissing, he allows that, he's okay with it. So people are already saying, oh my God, are we going back to the Ayyam Hassan Thani, but Ayyam Hassan Thalith? I don't know. I don't want to be just, what do you call it, predicting based on gossip, but I think there's something going on that's not, but maybe other people can enlighten me. I have no idea how to interpret also this particular personal dynamic that's going on in the palace. And but I would not be surprised if very soon there will be an announcement that there will be a new king.
Thank you, Miriam. We have lots of questions still and not much time, so I'm going to give the floor back. There was Badr and Shano. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Aouragh.
Can you hear it, Miriam?
Yes.
Can you
Can
hear?
you-
Yes.
I have a question about like the narratives about normalization, especially like after the Abraham Accords in Morocco. And so like, do you see that there is any shifts in discourse like on Israel and normalization, like from between the era of Hassan II and Muhammad VI? And also like, do you think that like activists in Morocco can still mobilize on the Palestinian cause in Morocco? And what are like the implications of this narrative on the collective commitment of the Moroccan people to the Palestinian cause?
If I may add on Badr's question, in your book, the chapter on Morocco, Miriam, there's a comparison between the PLO and the Polisario as being state units without territories, and sort of a similarity between the two movements. So I think just to complement your question. Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Aouragh, for joining us today. My question is more about the analysis. I am really curious about the ways in which we attempt to read through and analyze and understand these kind of situations that are very sensitive and complex. How can we analyze them in a way that's not romanticizing the narrative in a way that might negatively impact what's called in the book ordinary people? And is it possible that this positive narrative can deflect the attention to the intensity of the issues? Because if we put responsibility on the ordinary people, how can that impact the internationally on the cause? For example, the book is about Arab Spring, but it reminded me a lot of Kurdish uprising also in 1991. You mentioned that we should look at identity beyond geography and more based on culture and shared value. And I think that's 100% true for the case of Kurds, because they are spread in different countries and there's this sense of kinship. But my question is, to what extent this solidarity can outweigh the political reality? Because, for example, in the Kurdish case, the political reality actually led to a civil war that thousands of Kurds were killed on the hand of Kurds themselves. So my question is, how can we put this responsibility, and is it okay if we provide a positive perspective looking at and analyzing these revolutions, or that's too optimistic? I also wanted to point out to the nostalgia, and which is I think it's very important that we incorporate the psychological aspect. You mentioned dictatorial remembrance. I think that's really the case with Iraq, especially now with the anniversary of the occupation. A lot of Iraqis, they grieve for the loss of Saddam Hussein. You mentioned like this solid, strong leader that they want. Even though it was like clear that there was a lot of oppression, but how can we analyze this? How can we analyze this and understand it on an individual level? What's the source of this remembrance? Because it clearly negatively impacts the way forward for any given country.
Great.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shannon. Do you want more questions, or do you want to answer? Maybe you have a lot.
How much time do we still have?
We have 5 minutes, but maybe we can extend
Yes.
it.
Why don't you collect more questions then? Just because it might be the last round.
Yeah, so we have questions from the online audience. I just want to say Abdullah responded to you saying he agrees it's a ticking bomb.
Oh,
So just
good.
question, yeah.
Not that it's a ticking bomb, but
So 2 more questions. One from Mahmoud Sarwat about the Western Sahara. He's wondering, how does supporting the independence by the opposition affect the wider Moroccan public? Does this support cause this supporting this cause add credibility, or is it alienating the opposition from the wider public? And finally, a question from Jason Davis asking about how strong is far-right opposition to these leftist activist groups? Are they receiving heavy support from the government? And is it built around a kind of hatred, similarly to the American far-right groups, which are heavily white nationalists? And we'll end with these questions.
Okay, I'll try my best, yeah? I might not be able to cover everything, but we can continue the conversation. Palestine and normalization. I think what I said in the beginning is really important to remember how things are live their own life, and how moments like mass gatherings, like political symbols during football championships or matches, actually just completely changes the algorithm you had thinking about a causality between the normalization of the state and the way people are going to be brainwashed is then really pushed to the sidelines when you see those kind of expressions. And everybody also knows that in a way the national football team, they could not have done what they did if they didn't feel vindicated by the people. They knew that the people would support them and would be outraged if they were going to be prevented from doing this political expression. And B, there must have been a green light also from the Makhzan, because of course this is a national team, and they, of course, there's quite intimate relations also with the state. They must have talked about it and known that this is what they will want to do, and they were not able to force them otherwise, which also suggests that for the state, despite its normalization, they know that this is a very ambiguous position, that they cannot risk to push too far and alienate itself. And so I think this has to do with the history also, and the fact that for the Moroccan progressive movement, has always considered Palestine, like when I interview activists, old and new, young and very inexperienced, they all say, Palestine qadiyya wataniyya. So they don't see it as a solidarity cause that you ran. So they see it as a national cause. This is our cause, right? So I think that will remain, but it's very also open to change. And I think that has to do more with the neoliberalization than with the political push. And I think that has to do with the fact that the desperation of people will also feed nationalist sentiments. So the nationalist sentiments of what one of the questions of Jason, I don't think the terminology would be far right in Morocco. I think far right is a Euro-American terminology that has to do with the history of Nazis and fascism, but we could say reactionary forces or right-wing reactionary forces. In some of my work, I also presented a paper at Historical Materialism about the Ayyasha. This is a phenomenon. They call them the Ayyasha. It's kind of like the Baltajiyya. And so I consider the Baltajiyya, the Ayyasha of Morocco, very close to what Jason was asking about, a kind of like a right-wing reactionary forces. One of the things they do is chauvinism. And of course, this could be expressed in racism, like anti-migrants. Like there's a whole situation, we didn't have time to talk about it today, but there's a whole new development of more Morocco becoming not only the exit point for migration from Africa. It always wasn't a very important exit to Europe, but is now also becoming a long durate transit point, which leads to actually an entry point. So a lot of the people who are in transit from other parts of Africa, because they can't cross, they sometimes just stay, and then Morocco becomes their entry, the new sort of host. This created also tension and anti-Black racism, anti-African racism. And the Ayesha has played a role in that in Tangier during my field work. The Ayesha also would try, if needed, they would be the agents that could mediate the kind of anti-Palestinian sentiment if they were asked to, if they wanted to do that strongly enough by using economics. So they could say, look, we can't even pay our rent. We can't even sort our own whatever. And I'm supposed to be crying and caring about Palestinians who are, I don't know how far away. First, let's take care of ourselves. And I think I'm not talking only about Morocco when I say this. I think in a lot of countries, you see this kind of sentiment. Like, let's first take care of ourselves before we keep on this whole slogan again about Palestine. I just don't think it's going to be very successful because it's very deeply ingrained. The support for Palestine, for the whole region, Palestine, it's like a scar that gets opening up. It keeps opening up, and it keeps like it's so fresh, and it's just not. We are not there yet to say that the sellout can happen in a systematic way. Western Sahara, on the other hand, is a much easier cause to sacrifice. It fits with the chauvinism because it is part of a claim of Moroccan nationalism that it's part of Moroccan territory. And I have to say, yes, it does alienate the left. You have to, that's why I also admire part of the left, because it's so difficult to maintain this position on the Western Sahara. You are a Khayan, you are a traitor, you are a sellout, you are a Polisario, you are an Algerian. That's also the racist discourse that they would use. You are an Algerian, that's why you are. It's hard, and it's so much easier to give it up, right? I mean, if you're interested in a set of agenda points that have to do with equality and justice in your own. But so I quite admire it. But I also sometimes am a bit surprised. I'm not surprised, but I am a little bit disappointed sometimes when I see that leftist activists or spokespeople really avoid the Sahara consciously. They don't want to talk about it because it's trap. And I sometimes feel like you actually do have to talk about it. You actually also do have to find a way that is not too suicidal to publish it in your leftist magazine, to talk about it, even if it's with a wink to the past, because there's so much in the past from the left progressive archives that you can maybe hark back to talk about the Sahara if it's safer than to talk about it in the present tense. But yeah, it's prison, it's loss of job, loss of income. It doesn't come for free to have that position in Morocco, and it does alienate the left from the wider society. I think the left lost that argument, and it will be really hard to win that argument back.
Okay, thank you so much, Miriyam. Dr. Aouragh, thank you for fascinating, touching on so many things, and there's much more to discuss, unfortunately, because of the events in Morocco, but also in the wider region. So we'll end the webinar here, and I want to thank you again for accepting our invitation. I look forward to your next book again, Infrastructures of Empire, coming up next year, I suppose. Yes. Yes. Hopefully, if we don't, have so many postponed and delayed due to the strikes here, but yeah. Of course, yeah. But anyways, we look forward to reading it at some point. So, okay, great. Thank you so much, and lovely to meet you. And take care.